Hi, I'm Pam Aliaga. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the exhibition manager here at the American Museum of Ceramic Art. And who's joining me today is Beth Ann Gerstein, our executive director, and who will be taking charge of the Q&A portion later in the program. Today's talk is titled Feminist Explorations in Contemporary Ceramics, and I'm going to be joined by the one and only Julia Haft-Candell and the wonderful Jenny Hata Blumenfield. This discussion will be centered on the feminist perspective in contemporary ceramics and how the Western art canon has influenced artists in clay. We're going to be starting off with a bit of history, nothing too crazy, but of course some visuals sprinkled in for context. Before we begin, I want to give those big thanks that made this program possible: the Center for Craft, National Endowment for the Arts, California Humanities, the Pasadena Art Alliance, Board Foundation, the Dew Foundation, and the LA Department of Arts and Culture. Like someone had mentioned in the chat, this discussion is inspired by our current exhibition, Breaking Ground, Women in California Clay, actually up for its last weekend here at AMOCA, and we're showcasing ceramic works of 44 women artists who have made an impact on the ceramic scene in California over the past century. Despite those challenges due to gender equality, these artists push forward, and this exhibition is here to celebrate that. The show is divided into 3 chapters, which represent the significant shifts in California ceramics over several generations of women artists. The first, which we call our trailblazers, who kind of fought their way into the realm of clay, and especially those educational institutions. The second chapter focuses on more our women artists who explored feminism, the female form, and the creation of the perfect form. The final chapter features the younger generation of artists who continue to challenge those issues, politics, identity, and environmental changes, and so many more things that are happening currently in our day. Breaking Ground will be open for its last weekend, so make sure to get an opportunity to visit us Friday through Saturday, and we'll drop the link into our chat box in case you guys are local or would like to come see us. All right, let's get started. Let me do a little crash course here on the movements of feminism. Of course, we're going to dive into ceramics pretty soon, but it's important that we actually do acknowledge how this first happened. So let's look at the first wave of feminism. We're going to call, obviously, the women's suffrage movement. Happened in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. The main goal of this was women wanted the opportunity to vote. They wanted that right to be heard and to actually make a difference in the law and to just be heard in general. Now, of course, nowadays we look back at history, and while many continue to celebrate feminist leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady, Stanton, the women's suffrage movement did largely exclude and discriminate women of color during that time. And of course, in the 1920s, the 19th Amendment gave that right to those women to vote. However, women of color were not given the universal right until 45 years later. So moving on to the second wave of feminism. Time is linear and we move forward. With that second wave of feminism, it was around 1960s at the start, 1990s. World War II was just getting out. Everyone was kind of settling in, kind of figuring out their household, seeing what America had to offer. Obviously, we were booming at that time, but a lot of issues came up for women. They were thought to be the American woman, the red lipstick, beautiful individual that would have children and love that space. And that didn't work out for everyone. So some of those issues that came up during protests were pay equality in the workforce, reproductive rights, female sexuality, and domestic violence. That said, the second wave movement had more attempts to encompass racial justice. So that was seen at that point. But moving forward, we are going to talk about the third wave, when a lot happened in the 1990s. We had the big march in women's lives in Washington, D.C. in 2004. And at that same time, we also had ACT UP and the AIDS coalition that was happening. And that helped organize the mid-80s sex-positive feminism that came into play with a lot of feminist activists and theorists. At that point, there was a big fight for autonomy to our bodies. and the right to keep abortion legal. And I believe that's something we're still fighting today. And a lot of these issues are still currently happening. Fourth wave at the moment is still considered now. We might be moving on a little currently to defining it, but I think it's important to talk about what is feminism, obviously. Let's just dive into that obvious question. I'm going to start off with this quote, and this will probably be the only quote I read off the screen to you guys, but Bell Hooks actually kind of explained it really well. There really wasn't a clear and concise definition because our world shifts and we shift with it. Feminism has gone through waves, and obviously each movement has had a different set of priorities for those behind it. Nowadays, we think feminism as a movement that seeks to challenge and transform social norms and structures and create equal rights, equal society for everyone, regardless of your gender identity. So moving on, I'm going to take a shift into the art realm. For those art history buffs out there, you guys are going to be pretty familiar with this one. I want to bring up this text from my girl, Linda Nochlin. Why have there been no great women artists? And this was a valid reason in 1971. She kind of shook up the art realm for this one, where she pretty much criticized the Western social and cultural economic circumstances that was prohibiting women from achieving the same rank as their male counterparts. And although she did not mean that title literally, it was very catching in the public eye. So let's move on to the next slide. This is kind of my confirming that there have been great women artists. Obviously, that was some time ago, and this text has been analyzed by so many tired grad students and undergrads. Here's the thing that Linda Nochlin was getting at the core: there have been great women artists. Women have always played a prominent role in the art field throughout history, although their contributions have not always been acknowledged. In the context of ceramics, however, women were notably excluded from the popular narrative in 1971, with a significant opportunity that presented those who had served in the World War II. This is just a part of history and also affected all the art canon. The GI Bill that happened throughout World War II actually was a pivotal movement in art history. There were far-reaching consequences in that field and for the role of women in it. The GI Bill simply allowed anyone who fought into war to go to college and do an arts degree or any post-educational topic they would like to talk about. This allowed for a good shift of men to actually come into those educational institutions and kind of be mentored by women, but how, for some reason, get more of a spotlight in history than them. So moving on, I actually want to bring up the male artist genius. This was something talked about in Linda Nochlin's essay. Understanding this artistic genius, typically in the art canon, we kind of refer to male artists as a genius for what they do. And here we have a lovely picture of people if we're in the ceramic realm, we kind of know these names already. Volkes, John Mason, and Paul Stoller. Very chill, very drinking coffee, very topless. You're genius. We typically link these privileges and traits associated with masculinity to these men in conversation. So something Linda Nochlin talked about in her essay is that why there have been no great women artists is because we have this so-called question of the male artist genius perpetuated in art history, which made it much more difficult for women to kind of fit those masculine roles. Now, we're going to move on to our Q&A portion with the artists. I'm going to be asking questions to Jenny and Julia. And of course, at the end of this, we're going to have a Q&A with the public, and we hope to get to everyone. But at the same time, if you guys have some dying comments about something, feel free to put those in the chat. But we will get to them at the end of the program. All right. So Julia, Jenny, you guys can go in whatever order you'd like, but I'm going to ask the first question. What themes or subjects in ceramic art do you believe have evolved in response of the feminist ideas and movements over time? Obviously, I just said a crash course, but you guys are, I'm sure, well versed in those.
Okay, I guess I'll
Julia?
start. Or I don't know, Jenny, do you want to start?
I mean, I think like there's a lot that we can kind of riff off of each other. But you're more than welcome to start, and I can chime in and we can just have a conversation around it.
Well, I think when I was talking to Pam earlier about this discussion, I was my first thought was like, how do we even kind of pin down an answer to this? Because I think that the way I see feminism emerging in all aspects, but I guess specifically here in ceramics, is that it is kind of like indefinable, kind of like related to that bell hooks quote, and constantly changing, and maybe it's about like finding and presenting new ways and new contexts in which to look at artwork. Do you have thoughts about
Yeah, I mean,
that?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting time and space. I mean, even when referencing history, we're referencing the last 100 years, which is quite recent. And even with all of these shifts in celebrating feminist ideas, every decade or so, it continues to shift with trends. And there is this distinction, or like this distinct visibility around the hypermasculine in the ceramic space. And now I do see a shift in female or women identifying practitioners and celebrating more of the softness in the materiality rather than like the exaggerated masculine, where it's about the performance of it, slamming clay, throwing things at the clay. And now I feel like it's distinctly kind of more focused around like labor more so, and what it means to sort of invest time into building form and building object, and rather than this like fetishization of labor from the past, or from the last or like the earlier years in the hypermasculine ceramic movement. I don't, do you feel that way, Julia?
Sort of, but I do feel like there's still the, like, I don't think the idea of the male genius has changed. Like, I think that's still very much present in all of how we view art, but especially in, I think it shows up in ceramics. And I think that there's still, yeah, it's an interesting point about like the softness. I think that I still see this like masculinity, or like sort of like a macho approach to working in clay, whether it's like how many times have you fired that piece, or like how much glaze can you put on that piece. It's like there still seems to be this like very similar approach that I would imagine was kind of like the Peter Volkus vibe, but I do think that over time, I mean, obviously things have shifted and there is much more space for many different ways of working with clay. And also just like as society has shifted with in regards to like women or women identified folks, like being given more opportunities and more space outside of the home and all that, there's much more space for women artists in general. But one thing I noticed about this show at AMOCA was how, and this might be now off topic a little bit from that question, Pam, but I was thinking about how rare it was to see all of, especially in the historical section, to see all of the work by these women artists without the seeing mostly men. Like usually in these collections of like collection shows, there's like, you have to see all the Peter Volkus, the the John Mason, these like names that, and many more, who I'm not saying they shouldn't be celebrated, but to not have them be in the spotlight and to just have these works by women was really it's something about it really was exciting to me. I hadn't seen that before.
It's just a big exhibition, so I think it kind of caught me off guard. Like I learned a lot of history throughout it. Having two giant rooms just full of women ceramic artists, I kind of walked in and just was like, oh, these are kind of the heavy hitters then. And I was like, I was just off the bat, like everyone kind of teaches you, like, hey, it's Paul Soldner, it's Falkus. And I was like, ah, yes, the big sculptures. And I was like, I understand. But you actually, Julia, you answered the second question, but Jenny, I would love to hear what you think. Moving on, I want to know how you feel the male genius influences the way you perceive ceramic art now. And that could be like just going to shows or openings, and there's a lot of male art out there.
There is a lot of male art out there. I mean, yes, I do feel that there's more consciousness around the shows that I see, but I will say that I do see more of a male-dominated presence, and in the works that are integrated within some, or like connected to some of the female artists' works that I see out there. But I guess for me, I'm so hung up on the idea of the male genius. I mean, there is clearly, if we piece this idea apart or kind of pick it apart, it's a really challenging one for me to kind of get over. Probably because of this idea that it just, it stems from, again, the hypermasculine and coming from the sort of Eurocentric domination of the art world. And so when I think about artistry and feminine artists working in the American West, I can't help but like continue to get stuck on that idea. So I don't really know how to answer it fundamentally, because it's a terminology that causes friction in my idea of of what the art space should no
Can I
longer.
go kind of like a little branch out to
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like the male genius, we're stuck on it in history, possibly because it is just this reinforced binary we set, that you're masculine, you want to show large, you want to go big, you want to explore, you want to put as many glazes as you want on a piece, see where you can get. Buyers are bigger for some reason. Do you feel like nowadays identifying males are kind of straying away from that binary in the ceramic world, or just in general on artists?
I think, yeah, I mean, I personally think that the other challenging aspect of this conversation is the fact that the market really dictates a certain type of work that people and artists and ceramic artists are having to make as well. And so kind of like dissecting what the market is dictating, even kind of seeing how the market is continuously valuing male artists' works at a much higher degree than female artists. I mean, looking at auction histories and such, and even in 2023, 90% of the works that are selling at $40 million or more are male artists. And it's really only around like 10 female artists that are really selling at that price point in a similar way. And so even looking at different markets, it's kind of further dictating kind of what the value system is around certain artists' works.
Yeah, and I think it's an issue of like the myth of the male genius is not only in the art world. It's like a Western. I mean, I think it's a symptom of white patriarchy, and it, like Jenny was saying, has a lot to do with this idea of like I'm thinking about like modernism and like the way that a lot of these male artists were taking ideas from indigenous cultures or non-Western cultures, and because they were doing it, these male artists were doing it, it was considered art with a capital A. And I think that continues to happen, but in all different fields, not just in art, not just in ceramics. And so I think it's like it's a symptom of our society. And I also want to say that, like, it doesn't mean, in all of this discussion, it doesn't mean that these male artists are not good artists. You know, it's not like creating a binary in that way either, of saying that, well, you know, like, they're no good, we shouldn't look at their art. It's just saying, but what about all of these other people that are also doing really important things, but don't have this like social, you know, label of being considered like extra important because of their gender or their race.
Let me ask you guys another question, a little less moved towards moving away from the male art genius, but the idea of, do you have any mentors or sheroes that have helped you influence, like within the clay community?
Go ahead,
Go ahead.
Julie.
Okay. Yes. Well, my first introduction to ceramics was through Annabeth Rosen, who was a really powerful mentor, really, at UC Davis, and I think she's a really great example of someone that should be very, very widely known.
Mhm.
Her work is amazing, and she's amazing. And also, I was lucky to have Kristen Morgan as a professor in grad school, who was also very influential, who is also in the Breaking Ground show. And of course, there's been many, many women that have been influential over the years. And but those are like my main two that I learned directly from.
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate when I was living in New York to be one of Simone Lee's first employees, and I worked for her for many years, for off and on for 6 years, and she was very influential to me at a time when I really did not know where ceramics would continue to move towards, because when I graduated university, I majored in ceramics, and at that time it was not as celebrated as it is now. It was still quite marginalized, and she really helped me to think about the materiality through the lens of philosophy, and also dissect it more within art history, rather than sort of get sucked up into what the hierarchical art systems were, which were largely celebrating painting. And so she gifted me a lot of text throughout those years that I felt were quite pivotal towards my investment in the material. So I would definitely credit her quite a bit for that time. And actually, she introduced me to Julia years ago, I think. Yes, at Long Beach. I think she was doing a residence there. And then so and so it's great. Yeah.
Small world.
I was just gonna say that small I was lucky and I was teaching at Long Beach for a semester and happened to overlap when Simone was there working, and met Jenny also, but Simone, in that small time that I got to interact with her, was also very influential, and I still think about things that she told me, and just her kind of presence was really, really amazing. Yeah.
I do love when that community comes together and just like makes those introductions with everyone to be like,
Mhm.
hey, have you met so and so? Because you don't know who you're going to run into in the future and actually be in a show together.
Mhm.
So I have another question. It might be a little deeper, but how do feminist principles such as diversity, inclusion, and social justice be incorporated into that creative process and production of ceramic art? Julia?
It's a big question. I don't have an answer, but I have ways that I've been considering. Like, I think about it a lot, and so one way that I've been thinking about it is I've started teaching classes out of my studio called the Infinite School, and the principles are really aligned with these issues and ideas that I have about feminism and social justice. And it's inspired by my experiences in academia, feeling like those things weren't happening. Like, I felt like I had to choose one thing or another, or I felt like certain people were being marginalized, and I wanted to create a place where people could, where these issues could be discussed and talked about, but also like make things out of clay. So that's been a big part of how I consider all of these issues in art making. And I also consider it within my own practice with this idea of the infinite, which is like a philosophy that I've been building and evolving that includes like the infinite school, but also these philosophies of collaboration and um, transcending binaries and questioning binaries and embracing paradox, all of these ideas that I think are very essential to for humans to become more comfortable with if we are to actually change systems that are in place. Um, and so those are ways that I feel like I'm approaching it, but I also don't feel like those are the ways. It's just like how I feel like I can make small dents in that big question.
Right. I mean, to add to that, like any form of leadership in which a woman is kind of penetrating a very male-dominated space, whether that be in academia or other spaces of entrepreneurship, and where they can offer more mentorship and the educators in that space is a really powerful one. And so as long as that continues and as things shifts and grows, then so I can see it being a positive direction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can happen outside of academia. I think that what I noticed is that within academia, it wasn't happening as much as I wanted it to, which was the traditional place for, like, I guess the more traditional place for education. But because of because of society and who was getting those positions, of who was in charge of these positions in academia, it wasn't happening in I didn't see it happening fast enough, or in the way that I thought would help people who like women or people of color who needed mentorship. And so, like, for example, when Simone Lee was at Long Beach just for this residency, I saw the way that she like wanted to be a mentor, to like, she took her time to employ women or students or students of color, and act as like this role model, really, in these small situations, even though she wasn't like teaching there or she wasn't in charge necessarily. So I think there's these like small ways that that we can, that we can. I think mentorship, as Jenny was saying, is a huge way to do it, to make change. It's just finding these alternative ways to do it that might be outside of the traditional normal ways to do it.
Right. Oh, Pam, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. We have some construction noises, but I do see that as kind of more common now is the mentorship. People are much more open to kind of taking on students or just kind of mentoring through their studio. So I think that's a wonderful way to do it. Let me go to the next question, which is kind of more of a relaxed one question, but how do you envision an ideal world, a new universe for women in ceramic art? This could be just like a one-liner.
You go first, Jenny.
Me. How do I envision an ideal world? I mean, frankly, I would love to see more celebration of female artists, and when I say that, I mean more so the ways in which they are compensated in the right ways, in the same on par with some of their male counterparts, and also given more opportunities than they are now. I think there are a lot of situations where things are evolving in a way that I would like to see it happen in a more rapid pace. But of course, history is a slow moving one. And so I assume that patience is a good part of this idealized world. But yeah, Julia.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think like I was talking to Pam earlier about how I really like science fiction and just like speculative fiction in general as a way to reconsider our current situation. And one of my favorite writers is Ursula Le Guin, and she's been really influential on my artwork and my writing. And I she has a lot of writing about how there's no such thing as utopia. Like there's no ideal, because every like that idea of ideal is really like bound to fail at some point. And so I think about more like how to embrace like paradox, and the more we can like have binaries not rule us and have more kind of like in between unknown, become more comfortable with more unknown and gray areas and nuance and complexity instead of having to define this or that all the time, I think is like the ideal if there is one. But it means that there's like all this discomfort and lack of knowing, and and so yeah, I there's a the book that I'm thinking about from Ursula Le Guin is called The Dispossessed, where there's this dichotomy that she set up between these two planets, where one is like this very like rich, basically like capitalist planet, and everyone is like excess, but there's like some really good things. And then there's this other planet that is set up to be the more like Marxist or communist or socialist planet, and there's certain drawbacks and pluses of that. And the sort of the overarching theme of the whole book is that like both are failures, or neither of them work, one or the other, but they kind of need to be somewhere in between. So that's like my my thinking about the ideal, if there is one.
Yes, I remember looking into Ursula Le Guin because I was like, oh, a sci-fi writer. I love that. I was like, let's look it up. And some of her quotes really kind of opened my eye to the fact that when you think of sci-fi, you get to think of these new realms and these new perspectives. And it just reinforces you to rethink reality, just kind of like the social structures that you live in now. And that's not really common, I think. We don't really get to really think about challenging those social structures. We kind of get tired day by day and just kind of be like, well, I guess I'll give in. Or until it really infuriates you, and that's what sparks a lot of it. Wonderful. So those are my questions, which we're going to move on to Q&A. I want to thank you, Jenny and Julia, for participating in this roundtable. It's been really great to hear your perspective and get to have this discussion with you. We do have some time for questions. So feel free to type up your question, and we will read it out loud and answer it. And if you specifically want someone to answer it, let us know. Otherwise, it'll be free game to everyone.
So the first question is from Phyllis Green, wanting to know, why did you ignore the very significant effect of the feminist art movement in the 60s and 70s? This movement was so influential and important women artists, especially in California.
No, definitely. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for bringing up that to my attention. I do agree, the second wave of feminism, there was a lot to talk about there. And one of those was Judy Chicago with the dinner party. She was kind of a big groundbreaker at that time. And we did our best in breaking ground. We actually had Judy Chicago's test plates with us. So if you ever do get to read the catalog or there's the exhibition, which obviously you have because you're in our exhibition, we kind of tried to do our best to represent that. There's a lot of history there, and honestly, I wish this would have been a 2-hour talk, but I think I don't have enough caffeine for that. So
Thank you, Pam. Pilar wants to hear everyone's thoughts about the vessel and feminism in ceramics. Jenny, sounds like you should answer that first.
Well, I mean, the vessel is obviously a very central part of the work that I do, and as a metaphor for femininity or for women in general. And I was reading recently Women in Ceramics and Community by Jenny Sorkin, in which she very much like dissects the conversation of the vessel acting as a shell for marginalized female labor. I like continuously using it as a symbol for that language and dissecting. Sorry, I'm just so tongue-tied this morning. And utilizing the vessel as a form in which I can use as a symbol, and repeating that act of a symbol to create a more ambiguous female form. Perhaps.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that, Jenny?
Yes.
I mean, the fact that you remove the center core of your vessels that represent obviously a female figure, can you maybe address that?
Yes, I mean I often do that to kind of obscure the sexualized nature of the feminine body, especially within art history, and the focus in which the female body is this like idealized form of femininity and sexuality. I try to dissect that and cut it apart and rebuild it as a newly whole self without having to sexualize it in those same tones. So the vessel is really like a wonderful stand-in for that conversation, for at least the work that I do. And So thank you for helping me here. I don't know why, but yeah, thank you.
That's why we're here.
Thank you.
Julia, anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's all right. The next question is from Megan. Julia and Jenny, where do you find inspiration for your work?
Yeah, go ahead, Julia.
It's a big question, really, because it's I'd say everything is potentially an inspiration, which sort of sounds like a cop-out answer, but it's actually true. I take a lot of inspiration from observations of the figure, of the body, of nature, of science fiction, as I was talking about earlier, of fiction in general. I think just like storytelling and histories, archaeology, symbology, language, words, communication.
Right.
So that's some of it.
Right. I mean, the great thing about art is that you can draw inspiration from so many different areas in one's life, and the influence that you can take from even the more domestic settings of the everyday object. And for me, I very much look to especially Japanese ceramics within Asia. And I look at their form, I look at the ways in which the design of that form influences the function and those little connections that happen. I also love idioms. I love like the duality and the playful nature of a sentence, or the ways in which like a vessel is referred to in so many human connections, like the shoulders or the lips, or those sort of double meanings and those double associations. I really I pick apart and pay a lot of attention to. And so even with certain works that I title, I very much use various idioms to title them, because there may be a like an idiom where it's like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Like that imagery that it paints is so beautiful without having to be so literal. And so those are the ways in which those are really the areas that I draw a lot of inspiration from, I guess, the playful nature of language.
Thank you. The next question is, do either of you think the material itself also feels very feminine coming from the earth?
Can I get this one really fast? I think it tends to happen a lot. We tend to just label Mother Earth as feminine, or when I think feminine, I think of just like presenting very feminine. And depending on your relationship with how you perceive clay, sometimes it comes on masculine as well. So it's one of those things that I think we shouldn't just, every artist is going to have kind of their conversation and their relationship between clay. Personally, I see them as a they, them, as earth. I don't see it as feminine, but I do like the conversation about when artists talk about kind of more of those organic shapes and making it a bit smoother. It comes up in conversation all the time, where it's just like, what a very feminine touch that felt like. And I'm always kind of a little like, where did you see that? But Julia, Jenny, do you have anything to add to the question?
I agree with that. I think it's like a socially constructed idea to think about the earth as feminine, and I know that many cultures have origin stories with like an earth mother, but I don't think that's universal, and I don't know if it makes sense for everyone to just accept it as a fact of feminine is the earth. I don't really think of it that way. And I also I think it's interesting that a lot of, like, as a teacher over the years, or just with my own art, like ceramic pieces very quickly can turn out very phallic without people really knowing it. Sometimes as knowing it, but it's like really easy to make these like phallic forms and then be surprised by like what you've made. And in that sense, it doesn't necessarily feel feminine. But again, it's like this idea of binary and like doing, you know, do we need to define it as one or the other? I don't know. I don't really think so.
Definitely, it could be ever changing. I mean, clay does change through the process.
It does. I mean, that's the most exciting part about it. And I think in a lot of my work, I'm addressing this idea of like masculinity and femininity being sort of like coming from one to another, and like this in between, and through the forms that I'm making in clay.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
The next question comes from Rachel. How do folks who identify as women counter the male genius archetype in the art world where there is such a double standard? Anyone want to tackle that one? Phyllis Green would like to tackle that. Will you unmute Phyllis?
Please, Phyllis, please.
You need to unmute Phyllis.
Sorry. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I am an artist who really decided on a career in the visual arts because of my involvement with feminism. So the feminist art movement was really important to me in getting my career, and also my choosing to work in clay and in other craft materials is a very important part of my statement, and that is to subvert the canon of Western art that presumes that everybody is supposed to do big, big, strong, heavy things. That was certainly the message that one got in the 1970s when I was an art student. And I really think that it's a question. I really think the art world has changed a lot. We have a much more global view now than the American abstract expressionist, limited abstract expressionist point of view. And I think women artists have to embrace that and celebrate each other and make and acknowledge the contributions that they have done. I mean, I must say that I was a bit offended not to be involved in this conversation, because I've been involved in it for 40 years. And that was my whole inspiration for being an artist. Not that I wasn't a child artist and had a lot of encouragement as a child, but as an adult, a big influence, or a big incentive for me, I should say, to get involved in art as a professional was in order to subvert the notions that said that this stuff that women is doing is wrong. And I think more women have to assert that point of view in their work and support each other to make that more visible.
Thank you, Phyllis. But can I jump to another question that you might be the perfect person to discuss?
Sure.
Let me get the name. Catherine has asked to please comment on Joe Loria's Feminist Visions in Clay from 95-96. It was a National Women's Invitational with Leah Balsham, her teacher, Beatrice Wood, and Judy Chicago, and many other prominent women ceramicists. Is that something that you want to take a whack at?
I was in that show also, so I remember it. And I remember it was really in the height or the beginning of the time that I was doing the body of work that from where the pieces that are included in the show that we're talking about came from. And I thought it was important and interesting. And still, when I think about women in clay now, there are so much, I think that proves my point. That is, you need to expose and support and endorse women working in clay in order for that situation to change. That is, in order for there to be more attention to women in clay. Judy Chicago certainly has a place in what we're talking about, but there's so many more women that are active even in our community now that should be celebrated and endorsed. So I think it's really a question of exposure, and also um, uh, making it clear that what you're trying to do, not just in what you present, but in what you say, and to try to make the field more inclusive. When I was just finished school, which was like 1980 now, so that was like 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. Um, one still heard a lot, oh, he's got a wife and a kid, he needs a job, and she's a single woman, she doesn't need a job, or she's a woman, she doesn't need a job. Now that isn't as overt now, and the field is much more open to many more people, as is the arts in general. So I think all those are good things.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you.
The next question is, I think for Julia and Jenny, is do either of you believe that the male genius archetype was made specifically to influence the market to turn a profit?
I think it was a way to kind of make women feel less capable in some instances. I think it's a way to kind of keep women to feel much smaller, so that they can not be competitors or be seen as competitors. I mean, a lot of this language, I do think, is a way to kind of celebrate the male ego while keeping somebody else small. But I don't know, Julia, sorry I cut you off, but maybe.
No, that's a really good point. I have trouble like separating I think the art market is a big part of it, but it's not just that. I think it is about power and profit, but maybe I don't know if it's like a conscious thing necessarily, or just maybe like the way that power is maintained amongst those who have it, which typically, like if you think about the economic breakdown, it is usually like white men who are profiting in these situations and want to, I think, usually promote work that is made by people that look like them. And I don't think it's conscious a lot of the times. I think it's just a product of again, like the structures of society.
Well, I think it's ingrained in Western culture. I mean, when we think about how far back the idea of male genius goes, it's hard to connect it to any kind of market activity today, but it's perpetuated.
Sure.
By structure.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a cycle. Like it all sort of cycles and feeds itself like a monster, where different aspects are. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy too. Because even as we're talking about it, I wonder this a lot too, and this kind of I think ties in nicely to Kristen's question next, which is like the more we talk about it, are we just promoting it? Like Kristen has this question. How do we consciously subvert the lineage of toxic masculinity in ceramic history and instruction, especially within traditional educational institutions? And I think that's a really good question in terms of like how to teach ceramic history without perpetuating these models, and like how do we responsibly change the discourse and the stories that we're telling our students, without leaving out things that we think are important, and sometimes by like I used to do this lecture that like about like macho ceramics, like I would show pictures of like Peter Volkus topless at a wheel with a cigarette and be like and like these are like these symbols of this macho kind of ceramics that we're taught, and and then I would show like an alternative of like Viola Fry and like Phyllis Green and like Annabeth Rosen and these and Simone Lee and these women that are doing things that might not be like included in the traditional discourse or history of ceramics. But then I wondered that even through doing that, was I perpetuating this idea of toxic masculinity as this fantasy, as this like thing that is still kind of like cool, that will yeah, so I don't know. And so how I think about teaching ceramics now is, or teaching ceramics history now, is more through like an emergent way, where I think through storytelling and through like question and answer between my students, and not really like a lecture from the top down, because I don't know how to tell the story without reinforcing these myths and ideas.
Mhm. I
Thank
love
you.
that. Yes.
Phyllis, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I just want to remind or bring up a point that I heard delivered by a male art historian some years ago now, maybe 15 years ago. And that is that you could write the whole history of ceramics, especially in the 19th and 20th century, without including men at all. I've never done the research, so I can't, I wouldn't attest to that myself, but there are, when on Sunday, I came to the show again and I brought a friend, two friends who were very interested in art, interested in ceramics, and they asked me who were the women in ceramics that were influential to you when you were a student. And there really weren't many of them. I mean, I'm sad to say, especially in California. I think California, there were more like the artist teachers. And I think, very respectfully of Laura Andresen and Vivica Heino, and as women who really made their influence by teaching, because they probably saw that first of all, there wasn't a great marketplace for ceramics, art marketplace like the one we have now. And secondly, that was the way that they interacted with people. So Laura started the program at UCLA by making Indian pottery for education students. And that was the kind of influence that women had in ceramics. And, there were women like Mary Frank who were working in the 70s, Viola who was working in the 70s. And they just, did what they could do and tried to make what they could do stand out in order to get the attention and respect that they deserved.
Thank you, Phyllis. I think this is a good time to actually wrap it up for this discussion. I want to say thank you to everyone who came and joined and asked wonderful questions. I loved them all. And if you haven't experienced Breaking Ground yet, this exhibition will be open for a few more days through March 12th. And to learn more about AMOCA and how to visit us and our current exhibitions and our future exhibitions, because we have a lot of fun stuff coming up. I'll drop the link in the chat for amoca.org. You can always follow us on Instagram, but a recording of this presentation will be available on our website in the coming weeks. Thank you again, and I appreciate everyone that came. All right, bye everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks for joining, Phyllis. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you guys so
Phyllis.
much.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Jenny.